Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Vesa Koivuma. I'll be the moderator of the webinar. Greetings from Wärtsilä main campus over here in Finland. We are just past the summer solstice, and it is a beautiful, beautiful summer evening out there. With the really the night has not arrived. It's a full daylight over here. So everybody participating, thank you for joining today's webinar. We appreciate your interest in learning more about the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Cruise Corridor. It is the first in the world. It's a complex challenge with an ambitious goal and with the potential for important impact globally. We hope today's conversation answers some of the questions and also raises some new ones. The question feature is available at the bottom of your screen if you can see it. All the participants outside of the panelists and the moderator myself, you are muted. So all your questions, please provide those at the Q&A button. And then also we only use your cameras when the individuals are speaking. So you will have that. This is recorded, so you're aware and you can visit and see this webinar again if you want to see it, or share with the friends, colleagues, or somebody who's interested to learn more about the green corridors. So, yes, as I said, QA button over there at the bottom. Submit your questions there. We have allocated time at the end of the program to respond. So let's get the conversation started. What is a green corridor? It is a maritime route that's focused on accelerating the adaptation of the zero-emission fuels and technology. The concept of green corridors emerged in 2021 when the 24 countries, including the US and Canada, signed a Climate Bank Declaration to support the establishment of at least 6 green shipping corridors by 2025. In 2022, Port of Seattle, Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority in BC, and 3 largest cruise companies sailing in the Alaska market partnered with the ports in BC and Alaska and non-governmental organizations to explore the feasibility of green corridor focus on cruise from Pacific Northwest to Alaska. 2 years in the partnership, today's webinar program will provide an update progress as a first mover. Partners launched a feasibility study in collaboration with the Maersk McKinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping to look the viability of green methanol to power cruise ships to Alaska within next decade. Today's program includes presentation from Mark Stark with the Maersk McKinney Møller Center. He is based in Copenhagen. The center developed a blueprint for assessing feasibility of green corridors, and it is involved in several green corridor efforts around the world focused on unlocking the decarbonization of the maritime industry. We'll then hear from a panel featuring Port of Seattle and Carnival Corporation to share more about the project and what they hope to learn from the study. First, we are pleased to launch a program with a message from the Congressman John Garamendi. He could not be here in person, even though he wanted to be here, but he wanted to share a federal perspective.
Hi, I'm Congressman John Garamendi. I want to thank the first movers. Somebody's always got to start it, and you're going to do that. Green corridors. How are we going to reduce emissions from the cruise industry? How are we going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the international shipping industry? Well, it's going to be done by somebody stepping up and starting the process, and that's what you're doing. We have a piece of legislation that fits this perfectly. It is to apply the renewable fuel standards presently available for automobiles in the United States, make that available to the shipping industry. And let's start with the cruise industry. Thinking about green corridors, oh my, it must have been 30 years ago that I took my family up the Inland Passage from Vancouver all the way up to Alaska. It was spectacular, but I also know that that ship was just pushing out a whole lot of diesel smoke. not going to happen when you get yourselves, as the first movers, putting renewable energy into those ships, reducing greenhouse gases as well as the odor. So go for it. Know that we're there. Know that there's going to be legislation that Miller Meeks, Representative Miller Meeks and I are pushing through, so the renewable fuel standard and the subsidies that go with it will be available to you. So let's get on with it. No, anybody from the Bay Area listening, we're going to make sure that the fleets in the Bay Area, all of them, are going to be with renewable fuel and low zero emission. Hydrogen perhaps, maybe in natural gas, whatever, we're going to reduce the emissions. First movers, that's you. Congratulations. Get on with it. Know that we're there to make it happen alongside you.
Thank you, Congressman Garamendi. We value your support and your interest in maritime decarbonization. All right, so let's move along. Let me check the technology. Mark, I hope you are online.
Yes,
okay.
Yes,
right.
I'm on there. Just
so
in the next...
I would like to welcome Mark Stark. Mark is a sustainability advisor at the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. Thank you for setting the foundation for our discussion. So, Mark, mic is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you for that introduction, Vesa. So, thank you very much for that introduction, Vesa. My name is Mark Stark, and I'm representing the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. If we can move to the next slide, please. So, today I'll give you an introduction into who we are, what we do, as well as an overview of Green Corridors and where the centre fits in to the Green Corridors ecosystem. And then we'll also take a deep dive into the specific Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor. Next slide, please. So the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping is a not-for-profit organisation based in Copenhagen and founded in 2020 with a startup donation from the AP Møller Fund. Our vision is to sustainably decarbonize the maritime industry by 2050, and our mission is to be an independent and significant driver of sustainable maritime decarbonization. Our strength relies very much within our people and our strategic partners, We have strategic partners, we have knowledge and academic partners, we have mission ambassadors, and by leveraging all these partnerships, we can take the findings from our project and propel them out into the entire maritime ecosystem. Next slide, please. The centre consists of 150 colleagues, spanning across engineers, across economists, scientists, data analysts, with 70 of, or around 70 of those colleagues coming from our 24 strategic partners in the form of secondees. I myself am seconded from V Group, our technical ship managers, seconded into the centre, and I spend 70% of my time with the centre. The centre, having such a breadth and diverse workforce and strong range of partnerships throughout the industry, commands a diverse portfolio of projects, all of which are focused on the decarbonisation of our industry. But today we'll just focus on Green Corridors. Next slide, please. So what do we mean when we're talking about Green Corridors? If we move on to the next slide, what you'll see is a definition there, and we define Green Corridors as commercially shipping routes where we have commercially operating ships using alternative fuel. But we do not just focus on the ships, we focus on the entire value chain. So that starts at the production of an alternative fuel. We look at the transportation from point of production to the ports and logistics. We look at the vessels which use those fuels and the CO2 emissions which can be abated through the use of those fuels. We also look at commercial and regulatory drivers, and that could be things like the Inflation Reduction Act. It could be the EU's Fit for 55 policy, as well as the impact that the end consumer or passenger, for example, could have on putting a premium on green transportation. Next slide, please. So there's 6 main phases to a green corridor. They normally, but not exclusively, start with a pre-feasibility phase where we look at the fuel production and interested stakeholders in a given geography. Within a feasibility phase, we take one very defined project, such as cruise ships on methanol, and we look to understand the technical and regulatory feasibility of that project throughout the value chain. We also want to understand the cost of that project compared to when the route is done on traditional fuel like LSFO. If we can find the funding, the project moves into the select phase and then subsequently into the define phase where detailed engineering, design and final investment decisions are made, and that unlocks construction and subsequent operation of green corridors. But what the centre focuses on and what we are doing within our green corridor today is the feasibility phase. We're not going past that. We simply want to understand what will it take to make this green corridor happen. If we move to the next slide, please. So in the pre-feasibility phase, what we'll usually do is engage a range of stakeholders to understand all the opportunities that are available to a certain geography. That will look at the different vessel segments, it will look at the different fuels that are available. As a centre, we then put out a range of options for green corridors, and we look to find where is the commitment, where is the drive to make one specific green corridor. It's from those specific green corridor, which has the backing of all the stakeholders throughout the value chain, that we then move on to our feasibility studies. What we see is that as you go throughout these 6 phases, as the uncertainty of what you're investing decreases, the commitment of the parties increase. If we move to the next slide, please. So the project for the Pacific Northwest to Alaska is a feasibility study. What are we doing within a feasibility study? So the centre has 7 work streams within our methodology for these studies. It starts with the corridor baselining. In the corridor baselining, we look to put real numbers into the project. This starts with what fuel are we using. It then goes on to how many vessels will be on this corridor and what size will they be. And the obvious next question is, how much fuel do they require? After, as a consortium of stakeholders across the value chain, we've answered these questions, we then look to test the feasibility. And that's what happens in work streams 2, 3, and 4. We ask stakeholders to provide an assessment of the technical feasibility and regulatory feasibility of producing the fuels, of the ports and having the bunkering and logistical infrastructure, as well as the ships being ready to consume the fuel. As well as the technical and regulatory feasibility assessments that we ask the stakeholders to carry out, we also ask them to carry out a cost assessment. Workstream 5 is a little bit different because this looks at either cargo or passengers and how much they would be willing to pay for green transportation. In Workstream 6, we consolidate all the findings from our stakeholders across the industry to then provide a total cost for the project, as well as stamp them as technically feasible and regulatory feasible. In Workstream 7, what we do is look to understand, okay, well, that's the total cost of the project. Can that total cost be met by the stakeholders alone, or do we require additional support? So you'll hear quite a lot about us talking about the residual cost gap. And if we move to the next slide, I'll talk through that now. So if we could press the next animation, please. So if we look on the left at the grey column there, this is a depiction of a cost for fossil fuel-based corridors, where the solid blocks indicate a capital expenditure and the hatched blocks indicate operational expenditure. This is done for the fuel production, for the ports, infrastructure, and for the vessels themselves. To the right of that, we have a depiction of what it costs to do the exact same corridor, but with an alternative fuel. Obviously, this is higher. If it wasn't higher, we would have all these green corridors in operation today because it would make financial sense. We're aware that there's a cost differential between the two options, and that is what is depicted and the incremental cost of green, the blue column, to the right. That is the delta between an alternatively fuel-based corridor, such as on green methanol, and a corridor which is using LSFO. If we can skip to the next one, please. And once more. So what you're seeing now on the left, that blue column, that is the same incremental cost as I showed in the last slide. What we need to do to understand how we reduce and plug the gap in that cost is we first ask the stakeholders involved in a green corridor, how much are you willing to put in additionally to cover this incremental cost? And stakeholders might do such a thing in order to reach decarbonisation targets. They might do it because they see it as an investment for future business development. There's a range of options, but the first step is to understand what the stakeholders themselves would be willing to cover for this green corridor cost. Workstream 5, which we mentioned earlier, when you're looking at the consumer or passenger willingness to pay for green transportation, that's what you see in the yellow. So by understanding how much of this incremental cost gap can be covered by the stakeholders across the value chain and by the end consumer, we're then left with a residual cost gap, which is what you see in the red. Now, this residual cost gap could still be significant, but what we aim to do within these feasibility studies is to put an exact number to this residual cost gap, because if we get to a stage where we go out and we look for funding to make a project materialize into the select phase, we need to be able to give concrete numbers, and that's what we want to achieve within the feasibility study. If we could go to the next slide, please. So, jumping into the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor, what is this that we've been doing and we've been scoping for the last wee while? If we could continue. So the vision for the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor is to accelerate the decarbonisation of cruise operations between Washington, British Columbia and Alaska. The way we want to do this is by assessing the feasibility of 4 cruise vessels to operate full Alaskan itineraries by 2032. We will investigate, if we could go back, sorry. We could investigate the bunkering possibilities at the home ports of Port of Seattle and Vancouver, as well as looking at doing this by 2030. The reason that we have by 2030, there's no hard commitments within a feasibility study. We are just assessing the feasibility, but there's no use in assessing the feasibility if we say it's by 2045, because that's far too late to meet the IMO targets. To make a real difference, we need to assess the feasibility of these projects happening in the here and now, and that's why we add dates such as 2030 to have the first vessel in the water, and 2032 to have all 4 vessels in the water, to understand, can we really make an impact? If we go to the next page, please. So within this green corridor, what are we trying to do? We will investigate the feasibility of producing 120,000 tonnes of green methanol, and we will provide a cost assessment for that. Within Workstream 3, which is led by the ports, we will detail the regulatory and technical feasibility of bunkering and moving green methanol from the point of production to the port, and we'll provide a cost assessment for that as well. Within the Workstream 3, we will also investigate the feasibility of calling at Alaskan ports while using green methanol. In Workstream 4, which is the low zero emission vessels, we'll detail the technical and regulatory feasibility of building and operating 4 methanol cruise vessels between Seattle, Vancouver and Alaska, as well as providing that cost estimate. And in Workstream 5, finally, we make an assessment on what passengers may be willing to pay for as a premium for green cruises. Having a definition like this, where we know exactly what we're investigating the feasibility of and what we want to achieve, really puts this project as one of the forerunners in terms of green corridors. It's a tremendous achievement to get to this stage. But not just that, it's also with the breadth of stakeholders we have. We've got more than 8 or 9 stakeholders, which is a lot bigger than the normal green corridor projects that we are running. And And what we've seen in the scoping phase is a tremendous will to collaborate, to create a difference. This openness to collaborate, not just with other parts of the value chain, but also with competitors, is super exciting to see these companies commit to that. And it gives me a lot of confidence that we can go and take this feasibility study right through to completion in terms of saying, yes, it is feasible, or this is what it would take to make it become feasible to have a green corridor in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark. Now that you got warm up, I'm going to keep you over here, get our panel together and have a little bit of a panel discussion, which is followed by the Q&A. So, Mark, you're already here. So now joining us, Stephanie Jones-Stebbins, Managing Director, Maritime Division at the Port of Seattle, and Bob Alton, Senior Director, Technical Programs and Decarbonization at the Princess Cruise. Both are part of the First Movers group leading the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor. So, Stephanie, I'll start with you. I understand that there are some exciting developments around this work. Remind us why you chose to focus on cruise and what have you accomplished over the last year?
Yeah, thank you, Vesa. Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Mark, for that really excellent presentation. So, as you mentioned, we launched the Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor about 2 years ago in May 2022. And we were able to gather interest from partners in this region under the commitment to explore the feasibility of a zero-emission cruise between Seattle, Vancouver, and Alaska. The Port of Seattle has greenhouse gas goals with targets to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. We also have a long history in this area of early environmental action and adopting new technology. The very first shore power for cruise happened in Juneau, and then Carnival Corporation also assisted us in led the way in putting 2 shore power connections here in Seattle, and it's almost 20 years ago now. So our partners in this efforts are ports, community cruise lines. They all have similar decarbonization ambitions, and we know that we can't achieve these goals without working together across the whole value chain with both ports and industry to solve the challenge. As Mark talked about, I thought really well in his presentation, establishing a green corridor and changing the way we're fueling everything we do. It works across the whole value chain, and all the partners along that value chain have to collaborate together, from zero emission fuel production and delivery, storage and bunkering, having vessel ready to use the fuel. We really need supportive regulatory and policy environment as well. So it's a really complex process that won't happen overnight and has a lot of different elements needed to make it successful. So the good news is that if we're successful, we believe the solutions we identified for cruise in the Alaska market can be applied to cruise routes around the world. So by doing this work, we really have an impact on accelerating cruise and maritime decarbonization globally, as well as here at home. So over the past couple years, we focused first on building a strong foundation of partnership. We developed a project charter early on, and then scoping a feasibility study. And now we're launching into the technical work around the feasibility study, working with the Maersk McKinney Moeller Center. And as we heard from Mark, really deep technical expertise there that's going to help us. And so much work has gone on behind the scenes to get us there. We had to agree on one fuel to focus on, which we narrowed to green methanol. We're working with the center to scope the project evaluation criteria and agreed to look at 4 cruise ships running on green methanol by 2032. We're including the feasibility of the first methanol ship in the water by 2030. Then we develop estimates on how much green methanol we're going to need to be produced and bunkered, and that forms the basis of the study parameters. We also didn't have any fuel providers engaged in the partnership, and so now we've identified a fuel provider who will lead the feasibility analysis on green methanol fuel production. So tremendous amount of work has gone into getting us where we are, and I think we're at an exciting point. Thanks for the question, Basil.
Thanks, Stephanie. And it looks like it's like when we last time had it around a year ago when we had the first of webinars. A lot of things had happened on stakeholder management and that side. So excellent, great synopsis. And I think that Mark, your presentation, people really have to go through a recording and recap. There was a lot of information, but it also showed a number of stakeholders, which shows that the maritime is really working together. Just getting Bob now involved with the panel since you haven't had the opportunity to speak. So Bob, as an industry partner, what do you see as the biggest challenge? And as you think about that also, if you can tell us about the green methanol, how would you do that work, and what are the costs involved?
Thanks, Vesa, Stephanie, Mark. Exciting developments and a big welcome to our Pacific Northwest to Alaska Cruise Corridor webinar. We know from our colleagues in Royal Caribbean Group and Norwegian Cruise Lines, who are also part of this first movers group, that these are all important considerations. As an industry, we are very committed to the pursuit of net zero emissions. There are, of course, a number of alternative fuel options on the table and under evaluation, and they all have differing opportunities and challenges. We should consider that for the cruise sector, our more frequent bunkering strategy does actually afford considerable opportunity for fuel flexibility. This emphasis on flexibility is a high priority as we move forward, and better understanding of green methanol is, of course, a key opportunity presented by this important initiative. We are working with our industry and regulatory partners, exploring how best to address methanol supply, handling, storage, and operational considerations, including supply safety and training. All these elements are where the Pacific Northwest Green Corridor feasibility study will be so important in teasing out all the issues. Methanol, as we know, does come with its own unique challenges around handling, storage, and consumption, which in turn impacts the vessel range when we compare to standard fossil fuels. And this only increases our focus on energy efficiency. Establishing a solid supply chain infrastructure, I think, will play directly to the opportunities presented by our regular same port bunkering strategy, which can only benefit the application of this low carbon fuel. When considering retrofit upgrades, we are working with our development partners to leverage their considerable expertise and realize a safe, fuel flexible platform, while at the same time being able to maintain operations on multiple alternative fuels, including biodiesel and methanol. It is also interesting to consider that a well-designed retro installation on a modern cruise ship does have the potential to achieve fuel flexibility in an incrementally shorter time frame. Vesa.
Thanks, Bob. So Stephanie and Bob, you already mentioned about some of the things about the feasibility study, but what are you looking to get out of the feasibility study? What questions do you hope you can answer through this analysis to make the Green Corridor really a possibility?
Yeah, I can start if you'd like. Thanks. Great, thanks for that question. So the feasibility sets up the research question of what it will take to have 4 cruise ships running their full Alaska itinerary on green methanol by 2032. So right now, we don't know if all the elements are in place to make that happen. And there's no guarantee going into this work that the vessels will be on the water. A lot of things out of our control as we look to fully decarbonize. So what the study does is identify the gaps that we have, the gaps that remain, and what we need in place to make this feasible for cruise in our region. So it really provides the critical information that we need to implement our vision over the long haul. So for example, the ports will be looking at what do we need to be ready to do to support bunkering of green methanol for cruise ships. The study will assess what's the current state of fuel storage and bunkering infrastructure and identify where we need retrofits or new infrastructure in order to store and bunker the amount of green methanol that we need for 4 cruise ships. The study will also assess what kind of policy and regulatory gaps we have for home ports to safely bunker the new fuel, and what the same for ports of call in Alaska and BC to receive a ship running on green methanol. We will need new regulatory and safety frameworks to make all this work. So those are just some of the questions that the feasibility study will be looking at that I'm interested in hearing the answers to from the Port of Seattle side. And I'll see what Bob has to add as well.
So, Stephanie, that's from the port point of view, and Bob from the industry point of view on the vessel side and cruise side.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Fully aligned with Port of Seattle on goals with this important initiative. A better understanding of green methanol infrastructure and supply chain with fuel availability at scale, I think, will inform our collective understanding and of course our decision-making process. Specifically discussing alternative fuel cost structure, the feasibility study will look at all aspects of supplying a sustainable maritime fuel relative to more traditional fuels. There is, of course, no doubt that the availability of alternative cost competitive maritime fuels at scale is a key issue today. This is why the maritime sector is asking the US Department of Energy to support a sustainable maritime fuel challenge focused on production development and use of low emission alternative fuels. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. And so, Mark, I'll bring you on the table too. So you mentioned on your presentation about other corridors that MMM is part of and working to. So how is this corridor different? What does the success look like in a cruise corridor? Because people see where we are heading, but really to know what the success look like, knows we can actually illustrate or visualize the goal itself. So tell us about the success of other corridors around the world and what can we learn from those?
Absolutely. So the Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping manages projects across both pre-feasibility and feasibility. And what we see normally is within the pre-feasibility, we start with these really big consortiums where we look to understand, okay, well, what does that part of the industry want and need? We then shift it on to the feasibility projects, where usually we have just one maybe commercial entity throughout each of the parts of the value stream to make it easier to go through the project succinctly. But what's really special about the Pacific Northwest Alaska, I think, is we've got multiple ports in the project. We've got multiple cruise lines. There's a huge emphasis on collaboration, which in turn allows us to create a much bigger impact. There'll be multiple companies within this consortium that will be able to take their learnings into their home organizations and duplicate that around the world. Some of our most advanced green corridors are currently, or green corridor feasibility studies are currently being undertaken in Chile. And I think one of the key drivers behind that success is the buy-in that we've had from the Chilean Ministry for Energy. We see that when governments are open to collaboration, we can move projects so much faster and get them through. And that really helps with the regulatory feasibility part of these projects, which is so important, and we can't forget it. And that's why when we talk about what success looks like for Pacific Northwest Alaska, yes, a huge part of it is understanding the full cost of the project throughout the value chain, but it's also making sure everything that we do is regulatory feasible, understanding the technical limitations there may be in the beginning and how we can overcome these problems as we move forward. And I'm confident that with the consortium that we've got, we'll be able to achieve that. Going back to the cost though, what does ultimate success look like? Well, ultimate success looks like understanding what that residual cost gap is, and I mentioned it in the presentation. What really is the gap to make these projects financially viable? But not just what is it, How can we overcome that gap? Is it through low interest loans? Are there subsidies available? Can governments get involved to help us? Or perhaps are the consortium willing to cover that gap themselves? There's lots of permutations which may help us to reduce or eliminate that residual cost gap. But without going through these feasibility studies, we don't know how much we're trying to close, and we don't know what tools we can use to actually close it. So the ultimate success is having a range of possibilities to close that cost gap, to understand that we can make these, or we can eventually move these projects into subsequent phases.
Thanks, Mark. And you talk about a lot of the collaboration, but also visualizing and learning as we go, because this is a new frontier for us. So going back to Stephanie for a moment, given Seattle's geographic location, have you considered other green corridor work?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Mesa. There's quite a lot of work happening in Seattle and Puget Sound region to accelerate the deployment of zero emission maritime fuels at scale through both green corridors and other efforts. So one thing I just want to put in context first is that the relative scale of our industry compared to the entire economy. In the United States, we know that about 27% of all energy consumption is for transportation. And within that 27%, only about 4.5% of that goes to vessels, boats. That's boats and ships. So the maritime sector as a whole is quite a bit smaller in comparison to other industrial users of fossil fuels. So in order to attract development of zero emission fuels from maritime, we need to aggregate demand all across maritime and maybe even across other transportation sectors in order to have enough scale to develop those zero emission fuels. So we're doing that in a couple ways. The Pacific Northwest to Alaska Green Corridor project is focused only on cruise, but the Northwest Seaport Alliance is exploring feasibilities of green corridors for marine cargo, looking at routes between Seattle and Tacoma and the Republic of South Korea. Also, the Port of Seattle is spearheading development of a sustainable maritime fuels collaborative in the Pacific Northwest. So the goal of the fuel collaboration is to bring together supply and demand stakeholders to chart an accelerated course for development and uptake of sustainable maritime fuels in the Pacific Northwest. So that's going on in parallel to the Green Corridor efforts of both for both cargo and cruise. Our aim with that is to develop an organized forum for overcoming competitive barriers. So aggregating demand, developing supportive policies, tapping the Pacific Northwest clean technology, and the maritime innovation landscape as well. That's been a real focus over the last couple of years. And pulling all that together to focus on solving these really complex problems and driving progress towards zero emission fuels. So the Sustainable Maritime Fuels Collaborative was successful in securing state targeted engagement with a range of maritime industries, fuel production, supply, technology companies in 2024, and it will leverage the work on Green Corridor projects underway in the region. And I also want to emphasize that's just the green fuels focus. There's a tremendous amount of work going on around efficiency and emissions reductions from other ways, like recently passed shore power order at the Port of Seattle. So there's a lot of other things going on. We're really focused here on the clean fuels. Before we get to that time, we are also working on using as little fuel as possible, which is another important element that we're not getting into here, but I just want to mention that. Back to you, Vesa.
Thanks, Stephanie. So actually, that's a sort of a nice setup for Bob. How is cruise industry thinking about this challenge, and what else are you working on?
Thanks, that's a good question. At Carnival Corporation, we take a whole business approach to sustainability across 6 areas with climate action as a key focus. This is obviously a true collaboration right across shipboard and shoreside teams, and decarbonisation is a whole team responsibility. Here, we have a multi-pronged approach to covering efficient operation, energy reduction, and alternative fuel strategies. Our HVAC service power package covering system hardware, software upgrades is a priority to optimize our onboard hotel loading. Developments to maximize our efficient use of waste heat, particularly in support of hotel services and when on shore power, are also in progress. Hull air lubrication, commonly known as ALS, is also being successfully implemented. This is where the ship rides on effectively a micro air bubble carpet, improving efficiency through the water and reducing propulsion power for the same achieved speed. This does remind me, our ALS application has enabled collaboration with the ECO program at Boundary Pass Underwater Listening Station. This is helping us to better understand the benefits of ALS in also reducing underwater radiated noise. There is the application of data analysis for voyage planning and efficient vessel operation through emerging technologies, which has an ever-increasing priority in our strategy to reduce emissions and supports our hull maintenance strategy as well. And then there's our food waste management program. This is another important sustainability initiative involving onboard processing to eliminate offload to landfill impacts.
Thanks, Bob. I've seen some of the numbers and actually tangibilities that what have you done and your colleagues, what have you done. It's very impressive, and the list of items almost is a reason to have another completely different webinar itself to go through that. There's so much to chew on there. So Stephanie, Bob, and now Stephanie, I'll let you start on this. So tell us about the partnership. In addition to the feasibility study, what other work is underway now? What are the most excited about the next 12 months or the next year? What's coming?
Yeah, thanks, Vesa. So, and thanks for sharing all the efforts going on, Bob, at Carnival Corporation. There's some super interesting things there. But transitioning to what we're doing collaboratively. So last year, the First Movers signed a project charter that committed not only to the feasibility study, but also to work together on near-term emission reduction projects. So one example, I referred to this briefly before, is supporting shore power investments across the corridor. So late this summer, we will complete a project to install shore power at our Bell Street Cruise Terminal at Pier 66. So it means all 3 of our cruise berths will have shore power. Projects like that are happening throughout the corridor. First Movers have also identified different working groups to talk about issues related to stakeholder engagement, to policy advocacy, as well as to greenhouse gas emissions tracking. That's one of the real challenging parts about the whole effort. So I'm excited about our work together to develop a baseline for greenhouse gas emissions for the corridor. One of our working groups is developing a framework that will collect and aggregate all the fuel consumption and greenhouse gas emissions data from all of the cruise lines. Data will be aggregated and anonymized so that we have a baseline for greenhouse gas emissions for the full nonstop journey to Alaska, back to the home ports. So that's going to be a really critical part of tracking our progress over time. There's that old adage, what gets measured gets managed. So this is a really important part of our overall efforts, is understanding the baseline. Our stakeholder engagement and policy working groups allow the First Movers collectively to collaborate on how we communicate progress and how we engage key stakeholders, including communities, industry partners, policymakers, to make sure that those groups will all be important to the success of the project. So we're also focused on advocating for supportive policies for sustainable maritime fuels, and we're tracking grant funding opportunities to bring federal funding to the region for zero emissions technology. and the infrastructure that we will need for that zero emission technology. And I think perhaps back to you.
I'll let Bob do follow up on that.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Great collaboration summary. Yeah, we have a number of in progress and developing initiatives with Port of Seattle, including collaboration on non-fossil fuel demonstration. This initiative will continue through 2025 to better understand biodiesel, particularly the supply infrastructure and bunkering challenges. And to that point, we will be focusing on evaluating the different specifications of biodiesel to better understand handling, segregation, and the reporting process. While biodiesel is considered a drop-in fuel, there are some system segregation and processing upgrades to consider, and interesting nuances associated with the compliance reporting and emissions analysis. And we will be getting to the heart of that. Shore power connection, yes, absolutely. This is a priority for us wherever possible, including Port of Seattle, Vancouver, and Juneau. We're also participating in the emission baseline working group, as referenced by Stephanie, along with our other cruise line first mover partners. And this sets out to leverage the IMO data collection system, DCS, through CLEAR for aggregation and anonymization.
Thank you, Bob. And knowing how the time is flying at the moment, and we are a couple minutes away from Q&A, Mark, I let you sort of wrap up the panel, and as you launch the feasibility study, what are the most excited about the learning itself?
Yeah,
you can do 30 seconds a minute.
Thank you very much for the question. I think there's so much to be excited about within this project. What we can't lose sight of is that the members of this consortium are pioneering decarbonisation. There will be so many learnings along the way throughout this feasibility project, and understanding them, having them in a package where we can say this is what it will take to make a green corridor happen is super exciting. And the second part of it is just to emphasize again, the willingness to collaborate with this group of organizations is immense. I've said it before in my initial presentation, you've heard it from both Bob and Stephanie in their words, and being able to lift this willingness to collaborate into our other Green Corridor projects, perhaps, so that we can have a bigger impact in other parts of the world will be super exciting.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for the panelists, and now comes the, shall we say, the challenging part, the Q&A, questions that you were not prepared for. Let's see if we may have some of the Q&A coming out of during the webinar itself. As you can see, that this part is slightly unpracticed on our side. So let me take the first question over here. Have there been any discussion of expanding the scope of the corridor to include things like a speed and discharge restrictions? These are the things that can easily be adopted today and lead to many benefits beyond the greenhouse gas reductions. Bob, maybe you start on that. That goes closer to your area.
No, absolutely. And yes, on the speed, we have a major itinerary focus and also focus on voyage planning. So that is one of our big areas that we're looking at, and is already actually under implementation. Discharge restrictions are already very well defined, and followed as per regulatory requirements.
Well, and I think it also people should be aware that you have impressive data analysis and capabilities of planning voyage and really the voyage optimization side. That people do. All right. So the next question. Thank you for the question to Kylie. The question is, why was the green methanol chosen as a fuel of focus? What other fuels were considered feasible? And let's keep it short, because I know that the list of fuels is quite long.
I'll be happy to take that one then. We did originally, when we went through the scoping phase for the feasibility study, we considered multiple fuels. But like I mentioned before, what you need is entire stakeholder buy-in, and the green methanol was the one fuel where we had all the parties saying we're interested and passionate about understanding the feasibility of using that. It's not to say that anybody wouldn't want to investigate anything else. I'm sure there are lots of other potential avenues to go down, but this was the one fuel where we got buy-in from all the stakeholders, which from our experience in these Green Corridor projects is vital to move them forward at speed.
Thank you, Mark. Any comments on the other panelists?
Yeah, and from our perspective, definitely we looked at a number of fuels, but green methanol came out with high sustainability focus as well, from a long-term aspect. So that's one of the other reasons that we selected green methanol.
Thank you. And then, unfortunately, due to time, this is going to be the last question, but we will answer all the questions. And of course, recording will be available for everybody. And we will keep you up to date on the future updates on the corridor activities. So here's the last question. If the first ship of the feasibility study won't hit the water until 2030, what is your realistic timeline of when Green Cruise Corridor would actually be implemented in the way that there will be a meaningful reduction in greenhouse emissions, including life cycle emissions of the fuel? And if studied, the fuel of green methanol isn't found to be feasible, how long will it until a meaningful greenhouse gas reduction can be expected? It's a quite a loaded question. So, but within the minute.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack at that. Thanks, Vesa. That is a fantastic question. So we know to get at the most meaningful greenhouse gas reductions, we need the zero emission fuels. That's why we're doing the study. So the study helps us understand what we need to bring those fuels to this route. And it's going to give us a roadmap that we need for implementation. So we'll be able to answer those questions. And just to be clear, we know issues will come up, but we're not expecting to take no for an answer. We're expecting then that what the feasibility study, the issues that come up in the feasibility study, we then will really apply what we learn to finding viable solutions. We have to get there, and we will. And this feasibility study is the first step in telling us how to do that. It's not the first step. It is an important step in telling us how to do that. So thanks for the question.
Thanks, Stephanie. And as we're closing up, it's my comment on my side, from the OEM side, and looking at this is that I think that people sometimes think that we are only focusing on a single fuel. The technologies that are developed at the moment and what the cruise lines are using are multi-fuel. And so we are not talking methanol to be the next 100-year fuel. The world of where we are heading is going to be a multi-fuel, and it will be there's going to be a different application and different solutions for different parts of the maritime. But this is, as Mark, you were saying, this is where we start. This is not the complete answer itself. And there's a lot of exciting things coming in the future, and we'll keep you updated. From our side, we went 1 minute over. We started a little late. Sorry about that. But thank you for everybody, especially for the panelists, but especially for the participant. Thanks for joining. Thank you very much, and looking forward to see you next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.